it's Suri, so welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm gonna do a book review that I was anticipating doing, but not exactly how I'm doing it. And that book is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid Kemmerer. As you might know, this is a YA Beauty and the Beast retelling that came out this year, and I've been talking about this, like anticipating to hate it, because usually I don't fare super well with these types of YA fantasy books, but I was pleasantly surprised to be sitting here today telling you I didn't hate it. And so I thought, since I've recently been doing a lot of negative individual book reviews, it would only be fair to do one that's not as negative, and also one where I actually have quite a few things to say, because usually what stops me from doing book reviews when I love a book is just that I don't have enough to tell you about it that wouldn't be spoilers, right? So I'm kind of stealing Murphy's type of review style today. I'm gonna give you 3 positives and 3 negatives about this book, and we're gonna just chat about it. This will be spoiler free. So as I said, this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it follows a young girl called Harper, and she's growing up in Washington, DC, actually in our time. And she has a brother and a mother. Their father ran away after he got into some trouble with a loan shark. Her mother suffers and is dying of cancer, and her brother and her have been kind of struggling to make ends meet to pay back the loan shark and to just try to stay out of trouble as much as possible, but it's just not always really possible. And then one day she just walks on the street and sees a weird looking guy attacking a woman, and she tries to defend the woman and ends up being the one abducted by this weird looking guy. This guy turns out to be Gray, who is the commander of the Royal Guard in a parallel world / magical fantasy world that doesn't exist in our world, but like alongside it, where the kingdom has been cursed. So the prince especially has been cursed, and he has to relive, or like the castle in which he lives relives the same season, so the same 3-month span, the same fall season, over and over and over again. And at the end of that season, he always turns into a monster that is not under his control, and he loses control of his own body and in his actions, and he basically just goes on a rampage and kills everyone. So by now, no one in the castle is left alive except for him, Ren, and his guard, Gray, who has sworn to protect him basically, so he stayed. But everybody else has either died or has fled. Time outside of the castle walls has kept on moving while he has been trapped in there, and in this time loop basically. And his kingdom has fallen into disrepair. There's also some threats from neighboring countries, so it's a whole mess. And Gray, every season, basically abducts a girl for Ren to hopefully make her fall in love with him, because when he makes a girl love him, he basically will be able to lift the curse, as we know with the Beauty and the Beast. However, Harper wasn't the intended target of this attack, and she doesn't fit his idea of, or like their idea of the type of woman that they would have usually abducted. So things get a little bit messier than expected, and the story kind of goes from there. All right, let's get into the pros. So for me, the first pro is the characters, which is usually something that bothers me in these books. I always feel like the author doesn't put enough time into creating believable, realistic characters that act like real humans would. And in this case, that's not at all the case. In this book, that's not at all the case. Harper especially is somebody I feel like I could really like in real life as well. She doesn't take herself too seriously. She doesn't take especially Ren too seriously, because Ren is pretty much like brooding, like your typical fantasy hero type thing, like brooding and filled with self-loathing. He blames himself heavily for the curse, because he is to blame, but also he blames himself for a lot of stuff, and it's basically eating him alive type of thing. And she doesn't always accept that at all. Actually, she just kind of calls him out on his shit all the time if he like descends into too much of like brooding self-loathing. She's just like, what, shut the fuck up, like you're doing things, it's fine. Kind of don't be such a whine little baby. not exactly in those words, but sort of that's the message that she gets across to him. And I really like that, because that's really what I would say to somebody who acts like this consistently. Also, she ends up pretending to be, which I find really funny, she ends up pretending to be the princess of DC, because she's from Washington, DC, but everybody just here, like, they don't know DC, like, they don't know Washington, DC, so they just call it the Prince of DC, like D-I-S-I, and I just find it so funny. I don't know why, I love that part of it. My second pro is the writing and the plot. I think the book is just really like pretty well written. You can tell Brigid Kemmerer isn't a bad writer at all, and just in terms of her language and stuff like that, I think she really paints a good picture of as I said, what these characters look like, what their world looks like, and stuff like that, and she brings it across really well. So I just like how this book is written, and also the plot. I love that it's not just the Beauty and the Beast setup, like to a T, even though that is where it starts off. But as the book progresses, and I think as we move into the sequels especially, you can really tell that she has created a much richer world based on this original story. Like, the kingdom becomes involved, the neighboring kingdoms become involved, that, as far as I know, are not a part of the Beauty and the Beast story itself. And there's just a lot more depth and dimension to the characters and to the story that is revealed as we move through the plot. And it's not just a story of like a guy needs a girl to fall in love with him. Like, sure, the romance is there and it's a big part, but it's not everything. And then there's also the whole plot storyline of like Harper trying to get home because of her mother dying and her brother being in trouble, and like she wants to help them. So she's really torn between this kingdom and her actual real life. And I just really like that dimension, and I honestly wasn't expecting to, because I'm honestly usually not a big fan of like paranormal urban fantasies. I don't know why, I find them jarring. Maybe that sounds mean, but it kind of feels like the type of fantasy a not so creative author would write, because you don't have to do any world building, right? You just like throw a bunch of fantasy elements into our world and then you're done. But in this case, I honestly felt like it worked really well, because usually it just kind of takes me out of the story. I'd much rather imagine a full-on fantasy world that doesn't exist than this like mesh-up of the two. But as I said, in this book, it didn't bother me at all, and on the contrary, I actually really quite enjoyed it. And my third pro is the disability representation in this book. So Harper, the main character, has cerebral palsy, and she has a limp because of it. She says herself that she was pretty lucky and that CP looks different for everyone, but this is just what her form looks like, and so she has this limp, but other than that, she's mostly fine. And I'm not typically somebody, I don't pick up books just because I know they have any sort of representation, like disability or minority representation, but just in general, I like how it's done in this book. I love that her disability is just there. She accepts it, and that makes other characters accept it, and that makes the readers accept it. It's sort of just taken for granted that this is who she is. It's not made out to be some sort of all-defining characteristic of hers. It's definitely not even close to her most important trait, I guess. And I love how sort of subtle it is in that, because I think a lot of books try to like go way too heavy-handed on this, that like force it down your throat consistently, that like, oh look, I'm very accepting of this type of person. And I just find that really jarring, and it comes across as disingenuous in the book, whereas here it's honestly just a part of her. Like it's not a big deal, it's not a plot point, it's not plot breaking, it's not anything, it's not immersion breaking. It's like, this is just who she is. She accepts it, everybody else accepts it because of it, and the readers accept it because of it. And to me, this type of representation is the most effective, because I imagine, in my opinion, like the ultimate goal with representation of minorities is that we want that to be just as like normal and taken for granted as everything else, right? Like, you want disability to be just as accepted as somebody with a not disability. So to me, in order to do that, you kind of have to just make it a thing that just exists, that you don't dwell on overly long, that you don't make into a bigger deal that it is, and it's just there, and everybody accepts it. And to me, that's like done really well in this book. So then let's get into the cons, and my first con would be that this book definitely has some plot and timeline inconsistencies. And this is one of the few things that I noticed right away. If you follow me on Instagram and my stories, I shared a few little notes that I'd written that I take in, kind of like the things that the book explains sort of sometimes contradict themselves as to how this world works, and like especially how this like time stopping dynamic of the castle works. Lilith, the sorceress who actually cursed Ren, tells him at some point, pretty much very in the beginning, that he has been in this cursed state for 5 years, which to me honestly feels like not that long of a time. Like, sure, if you have to go through like torture or you're in prison or anything like that, some similar to what he's going through, I'm sure it feels like a long time, but to me 5 years is still different from like 500 years, right? And usually these types of curses have always been in place for way longer than just 5 years. So to me that was like, that it's really not that long. But of course that was necessary in order for the kingdom to even still be functional, because imagine like a kingdom 500 years without a ruler or anything or anybody to take care of them would probably not even exist, at least not in its original form. So it does make sense for the plot, but to me it was a little bit like, really? But then more importantly, Ren and Grey both say that they've probably abducted somewhere around 300 women already. And that really gave me pause, because I sat down and I did the math and it just doesn't add up. So if we assume a season lasts 3 months, as every season does, kind of, you know, you have 4 seasons every year, obviously. And if it was 5 years, that means you had 20 seasons in 5 years. And that means 20 girls. If he abducts 1 girl every season, that means 20 girls. And he even says some seasons he killed himself or something happened that like cut the season short and caused it to restart quicker. But even then, even if we say, okay, we assume he took 300 girls, that means over the course of 5 years, every season lasted maybe 6 days. Most likely actually less than 6 days. So you're really telling me that he killed himself so many times, like some of these seasons were only 6 days or less instead of 3 months? I just don't believe you. And then add to that, that I assume if he had planned to kill himself on the first day of a season, why would he bother to abduct a girl in the first place if he knew that he wasn't gonna even try to convince her to love him? So these types of things just don't add up to me, and it's for me a sign of a bigger problem in the book, that sometimes the author didn't really know what she was going for. And this then will tie into my second point, but just for the timeline and like, you know, these sort of details, I feel like she wanted it to be a really long time and like make it seem like he had 300 girls and like he failed every time. And there's also a big part of like Ren saying he's changed so much through the curse. Like before the curse, he was like a really horrible person, and through that and these experiences and like losing so many people and all that, he changed a lot. And again, I feel like, sure, it's like I do sort of believe you over the 5 years, but I mean, obviously it would have been much more impactful and much more believable if it had been like 500 and he was like literally worn down by this and having had so many girls, like they all looked the same to him and seemed the same. And it's like, you know what I mean? I think you do. Like the level of desperation and the level of like extreme torture is definitely very different. And the 5 years just sort of undermine that and also take away from the believability of everything else that the author is trying to sell to you. And as I said, this ties into my second point, which is also that the author, to me, couldn't really decide if she wanted to stick closely to the Beauty and the Beast story or subvert it in some way and sort of maybe even go in the face of it and be like, no, I'm not gonna like fall in love with this guy that I don't know just to save like him and his kingdom from a curse that I have nothing to do with, right? Like that would have been also really, really interesting. And the reason I'm saying this is because she has a lot of great chemistry with the guardsman Grey. And I've read many reviews and talked to people on Instagram, like filming pages, and they also all say that like they feel like Harper had much better chemistry with Grey and was given many more meaningful and genuine and honestly like affectionate moments with the guardsman. Before then, the author realized, oh no, this is the wrong person. Actually, I need her to like Ren. And then all of a sudden, this dynamic twisted and she basically just transferred her emotion for Grey over to Ren without really enough reason for that to really happen. And I do agree with that to some extent, which is why I'm mentioning as a con. I think It definitely seems like the author at first maybe was like, maybe I should like introduce some like love triangle or like conflict here. Like maybe she wouldn't actually end up falling in love with the guy that would end the curse, but she'd fall in love with this other guy who's really kind to her and who she gets along with really, really well. And I think that actually might have made a more interesting story even, you know, because it's so different. And if somebody is watching this and wants to write that, please do, because I would read it, I promise you. And it does come off pretty jarring and very sudden, how at first she spends so much time with Gray, and then, as I said, when the author kind of decides, oh, it's time to switch to Ren, Gray really fades into the background, and they don't have these moments anymore for no apparent reason. It just kind of stops, and it feels a little forced and not genuine, as I said. And before you say, oh no, a love triangle, let me reassure you, it's not actually love triangle. It's close to it just because she's like drawn to both of these people. I wouldn't say it's like your typical love triangle, and I don't expect it to become one in the sequels. At least I hope so, because that would be very bad. But yeah, if you're like somebody who doesn't like love triangles like I usually am, I don't think that this is like a good example of one. And then my last con would be something that has always bothered me in general in books, and this one does it a lot at the beginning. It does get better over time. Especially at the beginning, Harper suffers very badly from not like other girls syndrome, which I hate. I think everybody hates, and I wish we could stop with that. As I said, Harper is kind of abducted on accident, so she doesn't fit the usual profile. So they constantly compare her to the other girls, who apparently all 300 plus of them were instantly like enamored with the castle and the magic and the prince, and like, I just don't believe you. Like, even if you're telling me that like they chose the girl specifically for this type of characteristic, this type of personality, I don't believe that none of them ever tried to escape like Harper does, or none of them ever put up a fight, or maybe aren't immediately not in love, but like in lust, or even like attracted to everything around them. I just don't believe it, and that's really a problem here. And I just hate when that is sort of pushed onto a main character. Like, as I said, I think Harper is a great character, and she has enough positive qualities to set her apart from like others, without forcing this very clear distinction of she's not as feminine, she's not as like into dresses and parties and like beautiful things, and that elevates her above others. And this kind of ties into another thing that really bothers me, is when strong women in books are always depicted as essentially just men with boobs, because everything that's feminine is stripped away from them. Like, they're into fighting, they're into wearing pants instead of dresses, they're into archery and horseback riding instead of going to parties and dancing or like other sort of feminine activities. And that is what makes them strong. And I just, the first issue I have with that is that it portrays these things as mutually exclusive. So basically, you can't like archery and dancing, you can't like to wear pants and like get your hands dirty sometimes, and also sometimes want to dress up and look pretty and be girly. And to me, that is such a limited worldview that I really can't get behind, and I wish this attitude would change. It's genuinely the worst. And I hate that we can't ever portray femininity as strength, or like as if the two were mutually exclusive, basically. So that's another minus for me. But overall, I think that this book is really, really fun. I think if you don't take it too seriously, and if you just go into it with an open mind, ready to just enjoy yourself, with characters that are likable and believable and that don't take the story and themselves too seriously, I think you might enjoy this. And I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. It's definitely one of the most surprising books I've picked up this year, just because I wasn't expecting to like it at all. I honestly was more expecting to do another rant video on it. So to me, this just shows that sometimes you need to pick up books that you're not entirely sure you will like, because sometimes you'll be surprised. And you know, some people often like tell me that I don't even know, like specifically seek out things to hate or like I only read books so I can do rant videos on them, or like I don't enjoy anything, and I think that's really unfair. And you know, I'm very critical sometimes, and other times I just enjoy a book for what it is, and this time I managed to do that. I really enjoyed this, and I'm definitely gonna read the sequel. It's coming out I think in January of 2020, so this was pretty much perfectly timed. I already pre-ordered it, so we'll see how that goes. It's gonna deviate obviously from the Beauty and the Beast storyline because that's basically wrapped up in this book. So I'm excited to see where the story goes and what the author does next, and how the cliffhanger and stuff like that is gonna be resolved. There we go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you've read A Curse So Dark and Lonely and what you thought of it. And I hope to see you back very soon with another video. Until then, have a lovely week. Bye!